Okay. All right. Welcome to Afterlives of World Building, the Legacy of Robert E. Howard. This conference has been organized by a class of my students, I'm very happy to say, for on behalf of the Dark Man, the Journal of Robert E. Howard and Pulp Studies. Um, I'm I can't stop but I can't help but enthuse that they have been working very hard on this, and I'm very proud of them. Um, And I think the results I'm looking forward to seeing. We're going to have some discussions about the scholarly approach to Robert E. Howard and Robert E. Howard's legacy in pop culture. And we're going to hear from Sarah Frazetta as the keynote speaker. So I welcome you all. I would remind you once again, this is being recorded. And just to make it all work out properly, if you could keep yourself muted and remember that your image, whatever you're doing, is being recorded, that would be helpful. So welcome. We're very happy to have you here. I'm going to hand it over to Rhys Lomas.
Well, hi everybody. I hope everyone's having a good morning, or I guess good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's very early for me. Um, I'll jump right into introducing our wonderful panels for this morning. Um, I have a nice little list here to go by. So first up, we have Laura Shubert, um, author of The Shadow King of Fantasy, Robert E. Howard, um, a Robert E. Howard Foundation 2024 Venarium winner, um, and a Central Texas alumni of Texas A&M University. Yay. Um, it's really weird to do this with silent applause, but we're gonna do our best, gang. Um, we've also got Brian Murphy joining us today. He's the author of Flame and Crimson, A History of Sword and Sorcery. He's been writing about all things Robert E. Howard and heroic fantasy for 20 years, mainly for his blog, The Silver Key.
Thanks for having me.
We have Jonas Prida. He's the author of several articles, including the American Writers Series entries on Weird Tales. Writers are H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Howard. Additionally, a contributing editor to Conan Meets the Academy, which helps situate modern Howard academic scholarship. He's a frequent presenter at the Popular Culture Conference of America, including this year's presentation on using large language models to explore the Tor Conan pastiche, and is an area co-chair for Pulp Studies. He's held a variety of administrative and faculty positions, including Provost Vice President for Academic Affairs at Point Park University and Hastings College, and his PhD is from Tulane University, where he focused on American popular culture before the Civil War. More importantly, he saw Conan the Barbarian in 1982, forever cementing his interest in swords, sorcery, and mayhem. Welcome to welcome to Jonas. We have S.T. Joshi, who's an independent scholar chiefly focused on H.P. Lovecraft and weird fiction. He co-edited A Means to Freedom, the letters of H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, and has written es- a few scholarly essays on Howard. And then finally, like a ghost haunting us all, Jeffrey Shanks. Um, who's an archaeologist and popular culture historian who specializes in the work of Robert E. Howard and other early pulp writers. Previously served as the area chair of pulp studies for the Popular Cultural Association, and was the co-editor of the unique legacy of Weird Tales, which was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. Currently serves as a franchise consultant and advisor for Heroic Signatures, and contributes regular essays for the ongoing Conan the Barbarian series from Titan Comics. So welcome to everybody. Very excited to have you all here. Okay, I'm gonna lob a softball at you guys. In theory, just to start us off, get us into this nice and easy. Um, for those of us who may be a little bit less aware of Howard studies as a whole, I'm just wondering how the group of you would sort of describe what academic scholarly approaches to Robert E. Howard actually is, what it looks like, how it's kind of evolved over a time, and what it contributes nowadays, in your own words.
Well, if nobody else is going to start, I, as a probably the old man of this group, might start things off. I think Howard studies evolved a little later than studies of other writers. The work on Lovecraft started really in the 1970s. I mean, there was fanish work on Lovecraft before that, and impressive work by people like Fritz Leiber and others. But the scholarly movement really got going in the 70s, and I was around in that day as a teenager. It was a very exciting time to be around. Howard scholarly studies, I think, to my mind, the landmark publication was The Dark Barbarian by edited by Don Heron, and published by Greenwood Press, and an impressive volume. I had some disagreements with it or some reservations about the contents, but it certainly was a good start to scholarly studies. And then there was the magazine The Dark Man, and it's just gone on from there, but I'm sure other panelists can elaborate upon those points.
Yeah, I would jump in here with just this echo everything ST said. By the way, ST, it's an honor to serve on this panel with you. I'm fanboying a little bit here, but I don't care. This is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. Love
Mm.
your work. But just to echo what he said. Yeah, I think another important place was Armora, which
Mm.
was a fanzine that was popular starting in the late 50s, 60s. Not really a place for scholarship, but there was some interesting articles that came out of that. Those were collected in a two-volume edition that we saw, The Spell of Conan and The Blade of Conan. But a lot of that stuff, I think there was some really good essays that appeared in there, but I would say it was largely fanish in nature, a lot of like Hyborian scholarship, Hyborian age scholarship, sort of exploring the world and letters back and forth and so forth. But yeah, I agreed with the Dark Man, really, the Dark Barbarian, excuse me, in the 80s, being the first major foray, I think, into scholarship in this space. Um, and then, of course, in the early 2000s, I think the other big step we need to talk about is the um, the unexpurgated original stuff from the Del Reys, the Conan Del Reys, which also has some fantastic scholarship from Patrice Lunet about the origins of Robert E. Howard's writings. So those to me are the two big ones.
Yeah, I'll pick up kind of where Brian left off, echoing again what ST and Brian said. The Dark Barbarian kind of kicked it off, but it was a collection of essays published by an academic press, or trade academic press, but it was kind of a lone voice in the wilderness, and I would agree, hit or miss as far as content. Um, Brian, I think your point is probably on the text was the biggest. That was one of the biggest hurdles that had to be overcome. For those of you that don't know, it was very difficult to get Howard's original texts for the most part during really until the early 2000s, until the Wandering Star and the Del Rey versions came out, and now the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press that are picking up the other texts. You can't do textual criticism if you don't have the actual text.
Yep.
You can't do any kind of real deep dives if you don't know, is this actually the words of Howard or is this the words of DeCamp or Glenn Lord or whoever, or Donald Grant or whoever is editing. Um, so that was a major step forward in being able to do any kind of academic work. When I got involved, I was coming at it, again, not from a literature perspective. I was coming in, I had an academic background, but in archaeology and anthropology, completely unrelated. And there was even into the early 2000s, you had the Dark Man. We had a journal that was peer reviewed, and it slowly evolved from I would say probably a high-end fanzine in a lot of ways when it first came out, when Rusty Burke first founded it in the early 90s. And it slowly evolved to become more scholarly over the years, over the last well, gosh, 30 years now, 30 years and change now. Um, I think one of the other major steps was when some of us started giving papers at academic conferences, like the Popular Culture Association conference that I was an area chair for a while. Jonas is a co-chair now. Also, ICFA, the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts. A number of us started going to some of these conferences and honestly trying to get caught up with the Lovecraft scholarship, which was a couple of decades ahead of us. And, ST, of course, the work you've done has been a model for us. I mean, you were who we were looking towards. And I don't even know if you remember. I think we had a conversation, I think, with Rusty and Mark Finn at Necronomicon a number of years ago, discussing this, and that was another effort, right? Even going to some of the fan conferences where there are academic venues like Necronomicon Providence, where they have an academic track, the Armitage Symposium. It was really just a matter of trying to get a seat at the table and claim a seat at the table, and and stake that claim and just keep building. And since then we've had other academic essay collections. Jonas edited Conan Meets the Academy, and I was very fortunate to have a chapter in there. That's how we first connected. And then under ST's as a series editor, I was able to co-edit a collection of essays on Weird Tales as a whole, which had a number of chapters on Howard as well as other writers. Jonas had a chapter in there. So it's just been slowly building. We've been building it piece by piece. Now we have biographies of Howard now being published by academic presses, and we have another essay collection coming out that's going to be published by Texas A&M University Press that Ben and Tracy, our co-hosts here, are going to be editing. So it's been a slow build, right? And to try and do this over the years, but we're getting there. We're making headways. And when I see things like Laura here on the panel doing her master's thesis on Howard, right? That makes me so, you have no idea how happy that makes me to see that, right? To see that there are young scholars out there that are picking up this mantle and doing this work. And I'm so appreciative for that. So.
Thank you. Thank you. And coming in way later than everyone else, right? Coming in, it's been pretty accessible for me to be able to find, and the people too. You go to Howard Days, your entire works cited walks into the room and you're like, oh my gosh, why didn't I bring all my books to get them signed? Um, it, Coming in at this point, I feel like I could go and I could find the books. They were there. There were options for me. And it's not as available online. And I think that's maybe where we're at now, that we need to get more of everything that we can, get it digital, get where people are, able to find it when they go on JSTOR, or they just go and they do a search online. Because I think that's where we're at with academics now, where are people going back and looking at the books? Are people able to find things, or at least find the names? Because if you find a few of the names, you can find everybody else. And it's a very accessible community. And I think that's taken a lot of work to get us to this point. I just want to thank everyone for doing that work. That then, like, I'm coming on and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, it feels like. So just want to thank y'all for that, because it felt like it's a lot more accessible than it was from ST Joshi's perspective.
I think maybe just to
So
fill in a
I'll
couple.
guess I'll, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I was just going to fill in a couple gaps. I think a couple other publications worth mentioning. When I was first getting into writing about this stuff online, I've been a reader, since the 80s, but really hadn't expressed myself in any way. But on the blog, etc., was long defunct. But the Sumerian, which was a print journal, but also had a website associated, encouraged me to write. That was where I published my very first essay. The Unnatural City, which was a look at sort of Red Nails and Howard's take on the modern city. I thought that story spun out. Now, it was a very supportive experience. The editors there, Leo Grin, Steve, the late Steve Tompkins, were certainly encouraging of me. And I think those outlets, that was a small but incredible effort to put that together. Another one was Robert E. Howard, Two Gun Raconteur magazine that, published everything from artwork, but also some essays. I had another essay published there. I love those kind of outlets because they allow maybe people who don't consider themselves academic, and I'm hovering on the edge of that description. I don't know, but it was encouraging to me to have those type of outlets, and I think those are important. I mean, I think on the Lovecraft side, it was a lot of those type of publications that would accept work of maybe more of the amateur side.
Yeah, just interject one thing. I met Patrice Louinet in France in 2019, I believe. And did he not write a dissertation on Howard for the Sorbonne?
He
Do we
did.
know if it's ever going to be
He did.
published?
Yeah, we actually Patrice did a dissertation, and there's we have another one. Dirk Gunther in Japan did his PhD dissertation as well on Robert E. Howard. So yes, it's not just master's theses. We have PhD dissertations now out there, and at the
But is
Sorbonne,
Lou
right?
first of all, did Louinet write in English or in French? Do you know?
He wrote in French, but he's going to be publishing it in English as well too.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Nice.
I will stay on him to make sure that he does.
Be a ghost, Jeff, around him.
At
Somebody
So
Howard
said,
one
Days,
that, oh, sorry,
at
go ahead,
Howard Days,
Laura.
Jonas,
he
we haven't
pretty
heard
much
from you
said,
yet.
Laura, please.
well, I say Patrice at Howard Days said that he has it in the works. He plans to print both the English and the French version. But I feel like he called us out a little bit because he said he made sure in France that they know that it's Howard and Tolkien side by side, and he was sort of waiting for us to do that here. And I was like, oh, I feel a little bit called out. So hopefully he can get those PhDs out and let us be able to read those.
The one that I was going to add, and we all know it's problematic, but it did something for I think all of us who read it, is DeCamp's Dark Valley Destiny, right? It's not good, but I can remember reading it as a kid and being like, oh, this is something. And it was kind of like Spell and Blade of Conan, kind of had that same thing. I remember reading those when I'm like 10 or 11 and having that moment of like, oh, this is people can write about writing, and that's interesting to me as a 12-year-old kid growing up in central Nevada. And so that's one that I think is a I mean, it's always got to be part of like the spinning of it. Um, Also, I was going to comment on the cover of there it is. The cover of the book that I did, Coda Meets the Academy. One of my favorite discussions about that was the can we get more skulls on the cover? Because there was just one, right? And it was like, no, there needs to be many. Yeah, thank you. Good use of the prop, Laura.
I mean,
And also, ST, it's great to actually like get to see you and be on a panel with you. I Am Providence was like groundbreaking for me, so it's great to be part of a
100%.
virtual experience.
Well, yeah, I'm embarrassed to say I actually never read Dark Valley Destiny because at that time my interest in Howard was not great and I had so many other things to do. I wonder though, in that sense, if that biography was somewhat like DeCamp's biography of Lovecraft back in '75, which also was not a good biography, but in a way fired up a lot of people. I mean, it got people talking. I mean, that book, the DeCamp biography of Lovecraft, was reviewed in hundreds of newspapers, magazines, Atlantic Monthly, Wall Street Journal. I mean, it put Lovecraft on the map for good or ill. Some of these reviews, if I may be pardoned for saying so, one well-known science fiction writer used that biography to basically thumb her nose at Lovecraft, but that's okay. That's just what happens. Um, Maybe that same thing happened with Howard. I wouldn't know, and you folks know better than I.
Probably not at the same level, but I think Jonas is right. It certainly, it was a game changer just to have a biography of any kind, even though it was as flawed as his Lovecraft biography was. I suppose you have to start somewhere, you know. And now fortunately we have Will Oliver's biography, so I want to put that out there too. We actually from an academic press, from a university press, that's an excellent work. Mark Finn's biography a few years back, Blood and Thunder, was in many ways a corrective to DeCamp's biography in a lot of ways, and situating Howard within the context of Texas authors as well, which is something that had not been done and needed to be done. So, you had to start somewhere. And it maybe in fact, in many ways, Mark's biography was probably one of the best really good early biographies, but it was a reaction to DeCamp's biography. And would it have even been done, if you didn't have that to start with? So, yeah, absolutely. That was part of it.
Bobby left a comment in the chat, Bobby Derry. I am dying to see if I could at some point. I know it was a limited edition. You had to be at Robert E. Howard days, and I'm bummed I didn't make it for this year. The interviews that DeCamp conducted for Dark Valley of Destiny, which, I think we all know that, yeah, that book has some flaws to it. And one of them was perhaps, and I don't know, but what I understand is that he would sort of ask questions with an answer in mind and frame these questions in a certain way. But this has sort of been speculation that I've heard. I would love to actually read the interviews that Bobby's gotten. Maybe we will see. It'll shed some more light on how that book came to light. Yeah, I see others are chiming in. I do want a copy.
Well, that was very informative. I'm very happy. I'm going to jump on something that Laura mentioned about Patrice and the idea of Robert E. Howard and Tolkien being sort of in the same genre and stuff. Um, I mean, I'm not going to assume that I'm much younger than a lot of you, but we'll let it sit out there. That said, I feel, I mean, my generation, we are a lot more knowledgeable about names like Tolkien and Lovecraft and C.S. Lewis and these sort of names. But I've found, especially in the last couple of months when I've been telling people about this conference, Robert E. Howard is not a name that people tend to like recognize for the author. And he's done so many different works and stuff, but I have to introduce him by he wrote Conan and he wrote this and he wrote that. That's how you know it. Um, is there anything in your guys's mind that has really like facilitated why he's known by his body of works rather than the actual like authorial author recognition that a lot of his contemporaries have managed to gain?
Well, back in the 80s, which seems like ancient history to people, but to me is already not that ancient. That's when the Conan movies came out, and at that time there was, a lot of discussion about Howard, the author of Conan, et cetera, et cetera. That seemed to have fallen by the wayside, maybe because there haven't been any. Have there been any big budget movies since then? Wasn't there there's a Solomon Kane movie I thought a little while back? But that the thing about Lovecraft is that his academic or scholarly interest has worked in tandem with the incredible popular appeal that just grows and grows and grows. And now Lovecraft is in a way of a sort of victim of his own success, where people mention Cthulhu and don't know where that comes from. It's just out there. I mean, it's so much out there. I mean, Cthulhu has taken over and sort of swamped Lovecraft himself in some ways. I mean, and the Necronomicon and things like that. Nevertheless, I think Lovecraft has attracted a worldwide interest simply because he has been now translated into 30, 35 languages, Serbo-Croatian, Chinese, I mean, you name it. Whether Howard has done that or not, I wouldn't know. What is the foreign response to Howard?
It's been pretty significant. Certain areas, especially Europe, has had more success. Not as much as Lovecraft, of course, but um, particularly in Eastern Europe, interest. There seems to be a large interest. But I think you're. It's a similar situation with Howard, where Conan has and other characters have um, outshone the author, himself, in the same way, um, because most people came to him through the comics, through the Arnold movies, right? The Marvel comics were hugely popular in the 70s, selling up there alongside Spider-Man and Hulk, like one of their top titles. Um, and so that pop culture version of Conan um, overshadowed Howard. Howard was being talked about. His name was out there, like you said, back in the day, but the character really did outshine him. And I would it's probably not fair to always pick on DeCamp. But I know he's an easy target. What do you want? Some of that I think also has to do with DeCamp. DeCamp was an excellent promoter of Conan. He was not the best promoter of Robert E. Howard. And there are a number of reasons for that, and I don't want to get down that rabbit hole. But I think that had a lot to do with it during that first boom in the 70s and 80s, early 80s. If anyone did go to look for, where are the stories behind all of these media, pop culture expressions of these characters, they would encounter DeCamp and DeCamp's introductions, which were less than charitable in many cases. Again, I'm biting my tongue here, but I think that's part of the problem, right? Even the main person who was supposedly the champion of Howard's work was not a very good champion of Howard during that heyday. And I think that legacy has been part of what we've been fighting against ever since.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a big part of it, to be honest.
Yeah, I came to Conan through the comics, Savage Sword of Conan back in the 80s. But I think even back then, Savage Sword did a pretty good job actually championing Robert E. Howard's name. Like he was in there quite a bit. They would use his famous, epigraph of the Phoenix on the sword at the beginning of every comic, and you at least were associated with his name, even if you didn't know a lot of his biographical details. But the main comic from the 70s, again, great comic, but it was really as much about Roy Thomas or who the author was of that story, and you didn't get a great sense of who Robert E. Howard was. And of course, the Conan sagas and the Lancers were fantastic as a way to promote the character, but his name being mixed up, with Lynn Carter or Elsbreg de Camp or Bjorn Nyberg or whomever, sort of muddied the waters a bit in terms of the original creator. And I think, that could be part of the reason why academic studies took a long time to take off. I always perceived Conan as just this larger than life kind of mythic figure that, as a young kid, just sort of materialized out of the pop culture ethos rather than being the work of a single author. It took me a long time to track that down, and back in the 80s, and it was hard to find much on Howard himself. Yeah, Fred Blosser, someone mentioned that he did a fantastic job championing Howard in the pages of SSOC, and I think, and Jeff, to give you a hat tip, you're doing the same now. With your essays, I think they're fantastic. They're a great, and the way you've written them is more of a approachable rather than stuff for the hardcore scholar, which I think is the exact right approach when you're putting them in the pages of a comic book.
I'm trying to balance between literary theory and just pure Excelsior,
yeah.
Right? Find the balance in between.
Yep.
I think another reason why Conan is different, because the character Conan, Brian was talking a little bit about this. It was part of the huge fantasy boom of the 80s and 90s. And, there's 50 of those pastiches that Tor just pumped out, right? Sometimes they're doing 2 of them a year. And so people began to focus, and as you know, they're all written by different people, right? Robert Jordan's got a bunch of them, Leonard Carpenter has a bunch of them. And so they're good training grounds for people who then go on to be other different kinds of writers. But it does make it so it's hard to think about, like, oh, this came from a person differently than this is a character. And then when fantasy kind of faded as an idea, right, in the 90s, early 2000s, and then the Tolkien stuff comes in, right, it's kind of like it also has right place, right time in a way that makes it so people forget about Howard. And then there was the Conan remake, right? There, that movie with, was it Jason Momoa maybe in it? And it had a chance, but it didn't catch like they thought it was going to catch. And so I think that's also involved in it. Also, Conan the Adventurer, the cartoon, maybe didn't necessarily help the Conan cause, even though I love them and think they're hilarious and watch them all. So I think that's kind of like what's going on, is that there's a lot of it was diluted, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I was just think it's a thing that worked against looking at Robert Howard as a primary driver.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll jump in on that. I had the same experience where when I said I was writing my thesis on Howard, they'd be like, who? And then I'd say Conan the Barbarian. Everybody knew who that was. I never had anyone go, oh, no, no. Everyone knew who Conan the Barbarian was. And I think that's like a testament to that. I remember my thesis, when I was defending it, my professors, I asked them, well, who wrote Superman? Who wrote Batman? And they couldn't name a single author when there's
Mhm.
a ton. There are a ton. And I think that's sort of a testament to that, because sometimes the characters are so widespread, so like you said, they just sort of sprung up into the mind of American culture, and they've just always been there. But they do have original authors. And I think it's worthwhile to go back, because they've created these juggernauts, and like, why are these so popular? We have to go back and find out why, what they were doing, and what allowed this to ferment and become these things that were so great, that are just in the minds of the American people.
I think Lovecraft does have a much longer history. Again, I think the early 70s probably was when we started seeing a lot more scholarship there, and his name is just much more strongly associated, I think, with, I'm going to mispronounce Cthulhu now because ST gave us
I know,
the
right?
how it should be, and I can't possibly replicate that, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Like, I think when people think Cthulhu, um, when they hear Lovecraft, I do think his name is more strongly associated with his creations as opposed to the other way around for Howard. I just kind of get that sense, and probably because of that longer history of scholarship and the Necronomic, the
Well,
convention scene.
I think one of the reasons why Lovecraft as an individual and as a writer is out there more than Howard is because of his letters.
Mm.
In some ways, I mean, the totality of Lovecraft's surviving letters is like 10 times the size of his fiction. I mean, it's that's only what survives. I mean, I have literally just completed a 24 volume edition of Lovecraft's letters to everybody that we know of. I mean, there may be more letters out there, but these are all that we could get. Only 24 volumes, whereas his fiction is in 3 volumes. Um, and as a result of that, of course, Lovecraft, the person, warts and all, and we know all the warts, is out there for anybody who wants to read it, and everybody wants to champion Lovecraft, or anybody who wants to condemn Lovecraft. It's all the material is out there. The Howard letters, I believe Necronomicon Press. I was involved with that minimally, even though I got a co-editorship, but I didn't do very much. Were published in like 2 volumes, what, in the late 80s, early 90s, in this microscopic type that nobody could read. We probably should have published that with a magnifying glass, but and then we did the Means of Freedom, and then the Robert E. Howard Foundation has done the collected letters in however many volumes. Then I don't know that those letters are really out there as much as maybe they ought to be, because they're fascinating letters. I mean, to me, they were really an eye-opening experience to come upon Howard's letters to Lovecraft. I mean, they went on for pages and pages and pages, and to me revealed a very different side of Howard than I had been familiar with. So that was an eye-opener for me.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you pieced this together. I'm holding up Means to Freedom. I cannot recommend these highly enough. I think this is actually the key to understanding a lot about Robert E. Howard and his creations. I think the letters with Lovecraft help Howard shape the Conan character and his conception of barbarism and civilization, which is so integral to that, was came out of that productive sparring and letters that we saw from those two. But would love to know how you were able to piece those together. Were all the
Well,
letters
okay,
dated?
it actually wasn't all that difficult in the sense that, okay, Howard's side of the course, I mean, sorry, uh, let me think about this. Um, Howard's letters to Lovecraft uh, came to us from Glenn Lord, I believe. He had copies of those letters, and most of them were typed because Howard typed. He didn't handwrite letters because it was just too much effort for him. Lovecraft loved to handwrite letters because that was his natural form of expression. So we got this huge stack of photocopies way back when of Howard's letters to Lovecraft. Lovecraft's letters to Howard apparently, in a most unfortunate situation, back in the 40s, Howard's father, I am Howard, the story is that he inadvertently destroyed the manuscripts. I don't know more than that. I don't know what the story is really. But before that happened, luckily, I think it was Dr. Howard sent the letters to August Derleth for transcription for the Selected Letters project. They didn't transcribe all the letters, but I would estimate about 80% of them got transcribed because you can see when Derleth got letters from people, he would earmark certain passages for his secretary, Alice Conger, to type up. And clearly, there are cuts in there, but there's still a lot of letters, or at least a large volume of letters, and that's all we have now because the originals are lost. And that was it. It actually was more difficult to get the Arkham House transcripts than it was to get the Howard's own letters because that itself was a production. I don't even go into the legalities and the logistics of that. But once we had the due size, it was there just to publish them, and then annotation with Rusty Burke and David E. Schultz, and there you are.
I see Rusty has actually joined us. I don't know
Nice.
Has he?
if you if he can
Outstanding.
chime in or if he wants to or has anything to add. I don't know. We'll see.
Unmute.
There you are. There's Rusty.
There he
I'm
is.
trying to figure out how computers work. Thanks for sending me the link, Jess, by the
Sure, of
way.
course.
I don't think I ever got one from the library. Anyway, do want to correct something. Somebody's posted that I did most of the work. I think David Schultz did the lion's share of the work on Means to Freedom. I just did annotations for the Howard stuff.
Rusty, do you know any further about why or how the Lovecraft side got thrown away or destroyed? I mean, I don't know what happened there.
What I have heard is that at the time that Dr. Howard was preparing to move to Ranger, Texas, to join with P.M. Kirkendall's practice up there, um, that he was getting rid of a bunch of papers and stuff, and he just inadvertently threw them all in the big metal trash can to be
Oh.
burned. So
That's a real
unfortunately, I
shame. But
think a lot of them were destroyed in that way.
yeah, I mean, I think we may have some postcards, perhaps. I can't even remember that now, but that would be all that survives. Such a shame because, and in fact, I think one of I could swear that Lovecraft said, "Oh my, the last letter I wrote to Howard was like a 32-page letter, which he may not even have read because he killed himself." But do we even have the text of that letter? I've forgotten. Um, I don't know,
No idea.
but we're lucky to have what we have. I mean, still we have about 200,000 words of the Lovecraft side, and the rest is the Howard side, which is in wordage a little more than the Lovecraft side, only because the Lovecraft side is not absolutely complete.
Right.
And just to kind of add on the talking about scholarship in general, I know for me personally, getting into the letters, both Howard's letters, to other writers as well, but especially his correspondence with Lovecraft, there is so much meat in the conversations that inform the stories and inform the works that you really, I don't think, can understand Howard's work and and the ideology that he's baking into his stories without reading those letters, not just his, but especially that correspondence with Lovecraft. I mean, it's incredible. I love one of my favorites is his story Children of the Night. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's the first time you get Conrad and Kirwan, and it comes directly out of a back and forth between Lovecraft and Howard in those letters. And in fact, what Howard does is he takes that conversation that he and Lovecraft were having and he puts it mouths of some of the characters in the stories that are sitting in a library, the kind of armchair anthropologists arguing with each other, about, blah, 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 right? You know, pseudo anthropology kind of stuff. And that's just incredible to me, right? That's where you can really see how important that was for Howard to have these connections with these other writers like Lovecraft, like Derleth, like Smith, that, even though it was an epistolary, acquaintanceship or friendship or whatever, what we would probably today call a parasocial, now that people today mostly only connect online a lot of times, right? It was a similar kind of thing back then with snail mail, and you can see how much it informs his works. For those of you that really want to understand Howard and where he's coming from, you have to read these letters. It's absolutely critical. So thank you, Rusty and ST, especially for getting those out there.
ST
Well,
did a lot of the pushing.
yeah, David Schultz he's a guy in Milwaukee. He is, either the lead or the co-editor on all 24 of the volumes of Lovecraft that we published, Lovecraft Letters.
Wow.
An incredible scholar, but extremely humble and just doesn't like to be talked about. But he has been a force in Lovecraft studies and as you say in the Howard letters and so much else. But so the totality of Lovecraft Howard's letters take up how many volumes in the Foundation? 3 volumes. The
Right.
other thing that we have to talk about again, as somebody was mentioning here, if you don't read the real work of the author, you can't really do scholarship. There's Howard's poetry. Again, to me, also an eye opener. And now that the
100%.
foundation has published the complete poetry of Howard, and that's again a real revelation. And I think Howard was a masterful poet, much better than Lovecraft. Not on par with Dark Ashton Smith by any means, because Smith I think is one of the great poets of American literature. But the poetry of Howard definitely needs to be considered as a major contribution.
I don't know how much that's been excavated in by academics either. I mean, I know there was a essay on it, for example, back in the Dark Barbarian, back in that volume, but I feel like that comparative to his prose fiction is quite underrepresented. But I
Yeah.
could be
There
wrong.
you go.
Frank
Well,
Kaufman's been the one that's kind of really kind of led the way, but he's kind of the only one that to do any kind of academic work on it. Now, I know Esther, you've published some of Frank's stuff.
right.
Uh,
Well, yeah, the problem is people don't read poetry. Poetry doesn't sell. It's
Yeah.
I keep telling the poets out there what an indictment of our culture that is the case. We are, we we've reached the stage, first time in human history where poetry doesn't matter. How horrible is that? Um, you got to read the poetry, and it's great poetry. I mean, people say, "Oh, it's difficult." It's not difficult. It's great fun. It's very enjoyable reading, and more than just a sidelight to his fiction. I think it has merits on its own and really needs to be studied more than it has.
I love that the Robert E. Howard Days still has the poetry porch light reading. I got to partake in that myself in 2023, and it's a great way of keeping it alive. Because when read aloud, it has extra power.
Even with all the trucks going by.
Yeah, little diesel background and noise, that's okay. Adds to the atmosphere.
I think that's a great jump into the next question that I had for all of you. I mean, you've mentioned his poetry, you've mentioned his letters, we've mentioned Conan, of course, and Solomon and all that. I mean, Robert E. Howard has such a vast collection of genres and topics and types of writings that he touched on. So I guess my next question for you guys is where does that lend itself to academic studies, right? He's writing sword. We call him the father of sword and sorcery and stuff. But I mean, he's writing stuff about boxing. He's writing about westerns. He's got detective novels and stuff, right? Like, where does the just with such a literary output that he's created, with such a wide and diverse range, what sort of difficulties does that give academic studies? What sort of bonuses does it give?
Well, I'll chime in here. Yeah, I mean, authors who are diverse in their content and their approach actually get slighted because of the fact that it's difficult for any person to encompass that entire body of work and find some sort of unifying theme in it. It is very difficult. Um, Lovecraft and Tolkien are very different. Their work is extremely unified. They each create a certain, imaginary realm that much of their work, you know, builds into, step by step. And so there's a sense of integration there in their writing that you don't find I would say don't find, but that is harder to find in the work of Howard and many other writers who've written, in a very diverse manner. That's simply an obstacle that has to be overcome somehow, and I don't know how to do it except that you treat each body of work on its own, and then somehow try to see how each element reflects some different side of that author's perspective or point of view.
I think one angle in trying to find something of a unifying theme is going to be explored in the upcoming book that Ben Garstad and Tracy Henley are editing from Texas A&M University Press that a number of us have chapters in, situating Howard again as a Texas writer and looking at how the landscape of Texas informs his fiction, even in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it, like the Conan stories or some of the his horror and that again to go back to the letters, a lot of what Howard was doing you can see in his conversations with both Lovecraft and especially with August Derleth when they're talking about their home areas, right? Their hometowns, their home regions. And Howard was in those letters talking about Texas and his area of Texas. And you see a lot of the things that he's talking about in those letters and in those conversations about Texas. You see that in his works, even in places where you wouldn't expect. And like you said, Esty, you got to dig for it a little bit, right? It's not obvious. But that's the theme of this volume coming out. I've got a chapter, Rusty's got a chapter, Jonas has a chapter, and a number of us are exploring that particular theme. I think there are others, but I agree. You gotta look for it a little bit. It's not super obvious, but I think there are ways to do it, and I think finally we're starting to do that. Hopefully there will be an audience for it, and hopefully people will pick up on it.
Yeah, you said bonuses, and like I think that is the bonus because when I was at Howard Days, I met people who came from the boxing side, people that came in from the Western side, people that came in from the fantasy side. We have people of all backgrounds, all over the world who are interested because there is so much there. There's so much to explore, and there's so many different ways to come in. And I think him doing all of those genres as a part of trying to make money, right? He was, writing for all these pulp magazines, trying to get something to stick. Like that made him a really, really good author. That made him a really good writer because when you have to do all of these genres, you have to learn all these different writing rules, and then you can start to learn how to play and bend those rules.
I wonder
Uh,
if
Go ahead,
how,
Brian. Sorry.
oh, oh no, it's okay. Just the fact that Howard didn't write novels. I mean, he does have like Hour of the Dragon, but a lot of his stuff is short stories, which is inherently these days anyway, not a popular medium. People want, to read to read novels. And so I do wonder if that has had any impact on him just being not as uh, widely understood in terms of the source material. I think it works very well in the comic medium, for example, for obvious reasons, the episodic stories, but maybe that's why, you look at something like Lord of the Rings, it's just it's the fact that it's published in novel form and in such a people tend to like these long stories. You look at Song of Ice and Fire, etc. I wonder if that hasn't worked against them to some degree.
Yeah, I can add from having just completed a biography of Clark Ashton Smith that'll come out later this year. I think the appreciation of Smith has been hampered by the fact that he didn't write novel. He tried to, he just couldn't get it done. I mean, Smith just worked best in the short form. And Smith, like Howard, had these fairly distinct cycles of stories set in Hyperborea, set in Averania, set in Zothique and et cetera, et cetera. And he himself in his own lifetime contemplated volumes of stories based in these cycles. It actually didn't happen. It only happened when Lynn Carter, after Smith's death, assembled them for the Valentine adult fantasy series. And unfortunately, those books did not sell well, so that in almost set Smith's work back a bit. But and Smith lived. He was around when Tolkien was writing. I'm not aware that
Hmm.
Smith knew of Tolkien or read Tolkien, but yeah, I mean, novels make a big difference. Because especially I think in a fantasy world, when you're trying to create a world, you need that kind of space to fill in all the details that allow a reader to become immersed in that realm. And hey, I mean, I love the short form. I think horror fiction in particular works best in the short story or the novelette. But as far as readership goes, people do like reading novels.
Yeah, it's just a bit of a hard sell these days. And of course, we do have the Hyborian Age essay, but you know, give someone an essay, a modern reader seems a little bit, I don't know, a bridge too far in some respects. I have no problem with it. I'm sure most people here don't, but I'm just thinking of your average reader. If you want to learn more about Robert E. Howard's world, here's this essay that he wrote. And Al Murick, yep. Al Harron called that out as another novel. There you go, Al.
Well,
I
novels,
have also
all of
thought that, like,
Howard's novels are
oh,
episodic.
I
Yeah,
mean, they were serialized, right? I mean, I'll tell you, Lovecraft did his damnedest to sell a serial to Weird Tales. It didn't happen. He thought he had done so with At the Mouths of Madness, but Farnsworth White said, I can't serialize this thing. Nobody will read it because it's pretty heavy going at the beginning, and it doesn't have a lot of action. So Howard knew better. Howard knew the markets way better than Lovecraft did, get a serial in Weird Tales. I mean, you were guaranteed 3 or 4 or 5 episodes, and with the revenue, what there was of it, that comes with it. So that was something that a lot of authors wanted to do because it kept your name in front of the audience month after month after month, and so you developed a following that way, and got a pretty penny's worth for that amount of work.
to ask
I
maybe a
think
little.
that he
Go ahead.
take it, Brian. Nope. Go
No,
ahead.
I was just going to ask maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable question, a little bit, but I'm wondering, like, I love these Del Reys. I am so glad they're out there. I think they're invaluable. The essays, the apparatus that's in here, the unfinished stuff. But I'm wondering if they're the best way to introduce someone brand new to the character because there's a lot of unfinished manuscripts in there because, they're, um, I think they're perhaps a little more framed for the corrective piece, maybe. And they err on the side of inclusion of all of his stuff. Like at the back, they'll give you all of the minute textual changes. I think these are incredibly important. I'm just thinking of a way to get Howard popularized again, if that's in fact something we want to do. Um, is there a
Well,
better alternative than these type of books?
I can again from my perspective on Lovecraft. I'm very happy that my very Orem edition of Lovecraft was published. I mean, it's a lifetime of work there in those 4 volumes, but they're not meant for the average reader. Um, what did happen, of course, is that I got Lovecraft into Penguin Classics, and it wasn't my doing, frankly. I won't even go to the story about how this happened, but Penguin Classics approached me about doing at first one volume of Lovecraft, sort of the best of Lovecraft. That was The Call of Cthulhu and Other Stories in 1999, followed by 2 others, which basically had almost all the fiction in Penguin editions. And if we want Howard to kind of take the next step, as it were, I think getting him into a series like that, as opposed to just your average mass market paperback, is the way to go. because my Penguin Classics edition has lots of notes at the back of the book, but you don't have to read them if you don't want to. You just read the text. I mean, they're all fun. And even in the Wandering Star editions, nobody has to read all the fragments if they don't want to.
Yep.
But it's good that they're there. But yeah, getting Howard, you mentioned that discussion that I had with Mark Finn and others. I think Rusty was there too at the
Yeah.
Necronomicon, and we were talking about how can we get Lovecraft into the Library of America.
Howard,
I think
right.
that'd be
That's right.
hugely important. The problem is, I mean, I was involved with the Library of America. I actually did their volume on Ambrose Bierce, but I've kind of lost touch with them, and I don't know who the current editor is. I'd be happy to approach them if I knew how to get in touch with anybody. Um, but that is I think that when Lovecraft appeared in the Library of America in 2005, I mean that was like, okay, he is now canonized. He is in the canon of American literature, and I think Howard needs to be there too.
Agreed. I'll add to that. I remember that Library of America conversation, and I realize now we've still got 2 or 3 steps probably before we can even get there, right? But realistically, the efforts are being made. To add to this, I had a conversation with Patrice Lunet along similar lines, and we were talking earlier about what he's doing and Laura, you referenced it, what Patrice was saying about how in France, what they're doing, it's very different and he's at a different level. One of the reasons that is, and Patrice was very specific about this, is because he's publishing Howard as Howard. They're publishing groups of stories over there, just Howard's collection of stories. They're not publishing the Conan volume, the Cull volume, the Solomon Kane volume. And I think that may be part of an issue as well. We talked about it earlier about how he has been outshadowed a lot of times by his famous characters. So, even that where you lump his fiction together under it's a book of the characters. And I'm, again, something we were talking about earlier, I'm thinking about even in the academic world, even in academic work on fantasy fiction. I remember I was looking at Farah Mendelssohn, for those who aren't familiar. Her Rhetorics of Fantasy is one of the major works, modern works on fantasy criticism, and she ranks different things. She talks about all these different authors like Tolkien and Martin and all of these fantasy authors. And then when she gets to Howard, she talks about the Conan series, not Howard, right? And lumps in all the pastiches together and treats them all together like they're all one author. Darko Suvin, another great scholar of science fiction and fantasy, does the same thing in his Seven Beauties of Science Fiction. These are major works of speculative fiction criticism, and they tend to lump Howard together, all of the Conan stories together as the Conan stories, rather than looking at Howard as a writer, as an author. And so I think that is going to be another hurdle that we have to overcome. His creation of these characters is one of the great things that he's done. He's created in Conan, he's created a character that's archetypal in some ways that has transcended its original medium, in the same way that Dracula or Sherlock Holmes or Tarzan or some of these other characters of early 20th century popular culture have transcended their original medium, but it's happened at the expense of the author himself in some cases. And that may be a hurdle that we have to deal with as well. Just a thought.
I wonder too if just the legacy of coming out of the pulp market. I don't know if there's still any lingering. Oh, that was in the pulps. It's not real fiction type attitudes still exist.
Yeah, let me add to that, because I certainly faced that early on in my teenage studies of Lovecraft when in the early 70s, and we can read from what August Derleth wrote, that he was constantly encountering that situation as he was trying to promote Lovecraft through Arkham House and others. Let me add that a lot of stuff in the pulp magazines is terrible. I mean, we have to admit that it's formula work. We talk about authors specifically aiming material for given markets, and there are some people who did that with this coldly calculating perspective. E. Hoffman Price and Seabury Quinn and H. Bedford Jones. They published enormous amount of stuff in the pulp magazines, but nobody remembers it, and it does not deserve to be remembered because it was the work of businessmen, not authors, in that sense. Howard was one of the few to infuse his own personality, his own perspective, his own zeitgeist, as it were, into fiction that even then was at least outwardly of a commercial sort. And Lovecraft says this over and over again, that Howard is in every one of his stories, but that's rare. Smith tried to do that too, I think, with some success. Lovecraft claimed not to be, he didn't want to write in the pulp magazines at all, but he had no choice, and he himself felt that he was sort of unconsciously corrupted by pulp standards in some of his later work. That was his perspective. I wonder if people even know what pulp magazines are today, but the origin of their work certainly was held against these authors for a very long time.
Yeah, I talk about that a bit in my paper, about the perspective of pulp and modern pulp studies. Just to say it's trash, but in a good way, because it's supposed to be disposable. It's supposed to be quick, and you read it and you get rid of it. Next week you get another one. And I think there's, like McLuhan, the medium is the message. There is a certain medium with pulp as a medium that, how do I say this? It was like a forge. You had to be good. It was fast paced. You had to get them to the editors. And if they weren't good, you got rejected. You're not getting paid. Like, I think that there's a lot in the medium itself that was changing, like you said, formulaic, how these writers were writing. But I think it was important because that medium, which, it's sort of around now, but it's been so influential. Like it's not in academics, but Howard's everywhere else. That's why I say he's the Shadow King, because as a very nerdy person, he's everywhere in the underground sort of culture of nerdiness that's a little more, acceptable nowadays, with like Stranger Things and D&D and all that. Someone asked the side that I came from as a young person. I lost it in the chat. But like, from my perspective, of course, the movie, my husband showed me Conan the Barbarian movie. But then the RPGs, GURPS, and you would talk about formulaic, but like RPGs have to make everything formulaic. They have to define everything. They have to give everything stats and numbers. And there was sort of that happening in fantasy. Like, the cataloging of fantasy was done under Howard's work, not Tolkien's work. Howard prepared the American audience for what was to come when they got Tolkien, because you couldn't really get it over here. It didn't really get popular here till the 60s and 70s, right? So yeah, I think there's that aspect where, like, maybe because it's coming from the nerd side, the geek side, the D&D side, all of these underground influences. That's really how I came to Howard, and that's how I think of why he's so important to fantasy specifically, because I'm coming from more of a fantasy perspective.
It's worth pointing out that pretty much all of what we call now the genres, almost all of them, horror fiction, fantasy fiction, science fiction, the love story, if that's a genre, and so on, all came from the pulps. The exception, I think, is detective and crime fiction, because that was formulated in novels, with Agatha Christie and John Dixon Carr and Dorothy Sayers and others. But even that, I mean, there were crime mystery pulps as well. Black Mask pioneered the hard-boiled detective story, which to my mind is the one great contribution of the American pulp industry to literature. Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler really are great authors, in spite of, or even because of where they published initially. So you got to give pulp magazines credit for that. But that's only because we've filtered out all the bad stuff. I mean, the stuff that we don't want to read anymore. Nevertheless, it's interesting, as I was doing this biography of Clark Ashton Smith, at some point in the 30s, maybe 40s, he was becoming quite disenchanted with the fact that he wasn't getting out there anymore. And he says, he felt caught between two stools. There's the pulp stuff, and then there's mainstream literature. and he says, I don't even read the mainstream stuff anymore because it's dead. It's not vital. I think the pulp is where things are happening in literature, more so than the work of, T.S. Eliot or D.H. Lawrence or Virginia Woolf. He says that's all highbrow stuff that it's only meant for a select coterie of readers. It's not meant for the general public, and I want to reach a wider audience, and you do that through the pulps.
Very, very cool. Very good insights and everything. Um, I mean, there was a couple of touch-ons here and there, um, about some very interesting stuff in my mind. But I'm going to jump on something that Laura said, which is just in regards to the RPG and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, I'm a classic student at heart. Dr. Garstad knows this coming in, but he used my love of fantasy and RPGs and all that to go, hey, wouldn't you love to do this conference? He has so much influence into that world of stuff. You'd love it. Um, but I think a big thing for me, coming from a classic side of things, is that, I mean, Robert E. Howard makes use of so much historical and mythic content in a lot of his works, especially when you're looking at the Hyborian Age. I mean, he reinvents a lot of like real world cultures. He takes from this and he takes from that and he puts it into a different sort of perspective. So I guess I'm wondering in your opinions, if that usage of real history and legend and lore and all that sort of stuff, is sort of a meaningful framework to inform a sort of deeper meaning within the Conan adventures and Solomon Kane and all of that, or if it's simply sort of an aesthetic choice that Howard is borrowing from stuff that he found cool and interesting.
So I'll take this from a slightly different perspective because I know that this is right up what Jeff does. So one of them that I think is as neat as the Western, because like Breckenridge Elkins, that would have been a huge smash if he ever would have got it done, right? If like that could have been his novel, unique comic voice in America, and that's taking from a history that's only like 50 years old, and something that Howard like. It's not the time before the ocean sank Atlantis. It was, oh, I know these guys who were, they were cow punchers, but I'm still getting that, and it's always translated through like my idea of, if I'm Robert Howard, of like what I think the West was going to be like. And so that's one of those where, because I was thinking about this question beforehand, where Howard's doing that. It's not always deep history. It's a history from 50 years ago. It's a history from 100 years ago, but it's always tied into like, how am I doing this? How can I revise what I have and my connection with the Texas landscape and history to do something else with it? So just given the plug for those Westerns, which are amazing. And as we know, he invents the weird Western, and like, if you ever watch Bone Tomahawk, it's directly Howard, right? That movie that came out in the early 2000s, which is a horror Western. And you can easily tie the pieces together from there. So there's my plug for the Western, which I think is a lost Howard voice.
Yeah. And I think it ties into what Rhys was asking too. Like, yeah, some of the mythic elements in his fiction are there, especially you see it in certain stories like Frost Giant's Daughter. But Jonas, that's a good point. Even though that the tales of the Western frontier were almost within living history, living memory of when Howard's writing, there was already a mythology of the West that was already developing. The Jackson Turner kind of, mythology of the West. It was already there. And with the humor stories in particular, you already have things like the Davy Crockett almanacs and things like that were developing almost in real time a folklore of the West that was then going back east and being published. And Howard was drawing on that, and even fake lore. right? Like Pecos Bill that is written purely as fiction in the pulps, an adventure, right? One of Howard's favorite pulp magazines that he was reading all the time, which was presented as authentic folklore of the frontier, but wasn't. And Howard was with the Breckenridge Jelkin stories playing with that. So that's an interesting kind of thing. He was working within Western frontier folklore as it was being created at that time in the early 20th century, as you say, within just a couple of generations of that historic period. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing. And it's probably an area, Mark Finn started touching on that, and a few others have worked on that. But I think that's an area that is probably worth exploring much more for sure.
An evident story like, Beyond the Black River, for example,
Right.
and the frontier, and Cormac McCarthy gets a lot of credit, rightly so, for Blood Meridian and the regenerative power of violence. But
Right.
this, you could see this in Howard early on with his stuff as well.
Yeah. And it's such a good point too. And I think this upcoming volume, I think there's going to be a lot of work on that. Beyond the Black River is a great example too. And this touches on a lot of what I look at is how Howard is building in some of these older anthropological ideas about how cultures evolve from, quote, savagery to barbarism to civilization, right? And that barbarism is the natural state of mankind, which is kind of that equilibrium between those two extremes. But you see that in his other fiction as well, right? That's what the frontier is. It's that liminal space between the untamed West and the civilization back East. And that's where he saw this happening. He saw the encroachment of civilization into his space with the oil boom towns and things like that. And so he's approaching, I think, the frontier fiction in a lot of ways, and he's building that even into his Conan stories, his Hyborian Age stories. It's not even so much that he's writing Conan stories about the frontier. He's infusing that frontier, that Texas frontier, into his fiction wherever he does it. And to get back to the larger point, he's infusing that folklore and the mythology of that Texas frontier into his fiction and creating a new mythology in doing so, which
Yeah.
is pretty darn cool, I think.
I think he felt that loss acutely, and you
Yeah.
could sense that in his stories, and that's not unlike Tolkien. That sort of nostalgia
Yes,
for an absent past, not that he can
100%.
remember within his lifetime.
Yeah.
Some of his most elegiac writing about the West is in the letters to Lovecraft and others. And he talks about how, you know, they're gone now with the wagon trains and stuff.
I
And
love that passage.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I feel that now in Texas. I come from a very small town like Howard, 1500 Moody, Texas. No one's ever heard of that. Um,
Hmm.
they say that Mr. Moody stopped at the train station, peed there, and then left to go to Galveston, and that's how the town was founded.
I love
And
it.
Central Texas stole our railroad station as well. So very poor cotton gin town. But you see that as I mean, Austin is blown up, all this, suburban, like suburbs being built, like it's absolutely crazy. And you feel that way. You feel like there's a musical album from the Blood Meridian book called Last Pale Light in the West. There's a line in there, and I think it actually might be a quote in the book, but they say running out of country. And that sort of feels like we're running out of country. And it's so nice to go back to Howard days because Cross Plains sort of was like the edge of civilization in West Texas, right? There's other towns and stuff, but that's when you get to the point where like it really is big open land. You can see in every direction. Like and I think there was a logistical aspect to that, going back to her original question of like why we were getting into like why he wasn't using exact history, and like he didn't have the accessibility necessarily to do it. He couldn't hop online and be like, what were the people in this country like? What was their history? He couldn't do that. And he could go and buy books, which is as an academic, you buy a book, you read the book. But the history that was being written during that time period was very flawed, very wrong in a lot of ways, and it just wasn't logistically possible for him to just use all of these civilizations across the world. So it's just easier, and I think he writes about this to his friend, to Tevis Clyde Smith, he says that, you know, if he just sets it in another world, then he can just make up the details himself, and it's just easier to get the stories pumped out because he's still on a deadline. You know, we still have the very like real world constraints to think about when he's, you know, during the time period. And, you know, post Civil War time period, it wasn't that long ago when he's in the 30s. And this sort of stuff coming out. Like, I was very surprised looking at the history of what he was reading for Atlantis and what that author was saying about Atlantis. And yeah, if you want to know why a lot of this stuff comes, go and read that. But what he does with Atlantis instead is great. Is fantastic. I love it. It's a huge part. Like if you want to look at like the under key tone of how influential Howard is in history, look at all the people talking about Atlantis, because that does not. I mean, Tolkien does his own type of version, but before Tolkien, the stuff with Atlantis was already into fantasy. Like you were talking about, like the shared American mythology that was happening because of Lovecraft, because of Howard. I forget the author who said it, but they called it like open source fantasy because all of these authors are adding in and sharing it and like working on top of each other. And I think that's why it's so like it's so good, and why there's a tradition to do that, and why TTRPGs, tabletop RPGs came from that, because when you do that, it's a shared fantasy.
It's co-creating. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
there you go. I call it subcreation. That's what Tolkien calls it. That's his
Subcreation.
term for it.
Yes, exactly.
Subcreation.
Hmm.
Because the primary world is always this world. There's always that question with Howard and Tolkien. There's not, oh, where the work's set in distant past of Earth. It doesn't matter. This is the primary
Right.
world. If you go into a book, if you go into a fantasy world, whether that be Middle Earth or Hyboria, that's the secondary world.
Right.
And Howard was probably one of the best to be able to transport you in a sentence from this world into his world.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder whether all Howard's work really should be considered fantasy, even if it's nominally set in the real world. I mean, the Solomon Kane stories supposedly set what in the 17th century. I mean, do they really? I would not consider them historical works of literature. I mean, they're fantasy in their own way. I don't think Howard cared about the nuts and bolts of what is actually going on in the 17th century. He wanted a character. I wouldn't say like Conan, but something of that stature to march through this particular historical period and do what he wanted. And it just happens to have been set in this nominally historical era.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, all of his stories have that aspect of view catastrophe. That's what Tolkien calls essentially that catch of your breath at the end, that surprise, that turn or hope moment or spark of hope. And that's what truly makes fantasy, or fairy tales as he calls them, because that's where they all come from. So I thought it was interesting when you were talking about the Westerns, because they were sort of making their own American fairy tales of the West.
Hmm.
And then he's picking up on that and he's adding to it.
Fantastic. I
I
love
like
it.
I like the thought of cross plains as the little bit of the frontier that's still left. So does that mean like the pavilion is sort of barbarism come back in, or maybe a
I
little
think
bit of that?
You've been there,
you said that.
Laura.
The meeting
Were
of
we barbaric?
barbarians.
Yeah.
As long
Yes.
as we don't go pillaging down Main Street. I think.
I mean, the town does refer to us as barbarians, don't they, Rusty?
Well,
But we're
The
barred
locals do?
to some
barbarians.
extent.
Barred barbarians reciting poetry in town.
Yep.
Right?
We have 8 minutes to go. What can we say in 8 minutes?
Well, I mean, at this point, I'm gonna open up if there are any audience questions. If you wanna send them in the chat here, just so we don't have 17 people talking over each other. I'll see if we can answer any of those, and if not, I guess I'll just keep quizzing you guys.
Mhm.
Also, Laura, as we buy time, I'm from rural Nevada, town of 2,000 people, which actually is where I am right now, visiting my parents. And it was interesting reading and being interested in Conan and playing D&D and all that stuff here, right? Of like, oh, there's, I'm 100 miles from a movie theater. This really resonates with me, and being able to live like, oh, I can see Shem out my window.
Yeah, like what is there to do, right? Except for to get together. Like I was playing in high school because it was $3 a gallon for gas and it was 30 minutes into town. But RPGs are essentially free once you get the materials, right?
Well, we have so many more forms of entertainment now than was available in the 20s and 30s. But you had radio, you had newspapers, you had books, comic books, pulps, not a whole lot of anything else. What are we on here? Oops.
Well, on that note, video games, I play a game called Conan Exiles, and it has about 20,000 players every day that are running around Hyboria
Wow.
in full 3D. Yeah, and they had an update, they had a graphical update. They peaked at 50,000 people earlier this month. And I'm like, how do we get the literature into their hands? How do we get all of them, with all of this?
That's a great point. The new comic series is doing really well. And it's reaching a lot of people, and which is nice. I'm fortunate I'm able to get these essays in there and maybe divert some of them to Howard. But that audience is dwarfed by the video game audience. It's massive, absolutely massive. And that's an audience we need to try and tap into. I know there's a bunch of folks that are Jay Johnson, a number of people that run some of the video game groups and various social media that are always trying to push those fans. Oh, you enjoyed this? Well, you should go read the stories, right? And trying to push people there. But you're absolutely right. That is a huge untapped audience, I think. And it would be great if we could divert some of them to the actual stories.
Well, I mean that's a great question. And hopefully one that will be discussed in our next panel at noon, which has Jim Zub, our wonderful comic artist. It's got Charles Gramlich. It's got who is it? Jeffrey Shanks. Gosh
That
darn
guy's
it.
everywhere.
I thought we'd get rid of you finally.
I will talk about some of the role-playing games and stuff that I worked on for sure.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions from the chat, so I guess with our last 5 minutes, um I'll just ask you guys each a little bit quickly, where you are hoping that academic scholarship of Robert E. Howard is going to head out. Where is it? How is it going to expand from here? In your own words, what do you think is the next step for us?
Well, again,
Hmm.
I think we've sort of touched upon this is the integrated approach, uh, not just all trying to tie all the fiction together somehow. Whether it's even possible to have one broad theme, it's who knows. But fiction, poetry, letters, life. I mean, I tried to do that in my Lovecraft biography and in other works. It's a tall order, and it takes a lot of effort. But there are people out there who are capable of that work, and I think that something on that order would be very valuable.
I'm actually gonna cut you the rest of you off because I have been informed that there is a question that I missed.
Uh,
Um, so for the group of you, um, Mitch de la Guardia has asked, do we need to accept that some fans of Howard's characters are fans of the character, but a decent amount will never actually be interested in the creator or original stories?
I think we can acknowledge it, but we don't have to accept that.
I mean, I think that we all acknowledge that that is already the case, right? That there's more people out there that are fans of Conan and probably even Colin Solomon Kane than there are of Robert E. Howard himself, the writer. I think Laura's point about the video game really kind of drives that home, right? There's tens of thousands of people playing the video games that are never going to read a Robert E. Howard story. And that's okay. That's 100% okay. That is what it is. Like I said earlier, sometimes you get characters that become archetypal and transcend their medium, right? I think of my kids growing up, they didn't think of Batman as a comic book character. Batman was a cartoon character. Batman, was Arkham Asylum. He's a video game character, right? And that's happened with how many of Howard's characters, certainly with Conan, I think. But that doesn't mean that we don't reach for that audience that would appreciate Howard, the author. We do need to keep doing that, and we can use the popularity of those characters, I think, to drive even if it's 10% of the video game audience or whatever, a small percentage, that does appreciate Howard, then I think we're doing good work, and getting them there, even if it's just a small percentage. There's room for both. There's room for appreciation of Howard the author, and there's room for appreciation for his characters, I think, too.
I'm not a video gamer, but aren't there dudes that just basically like stream broadcast themselves playing a game while narrating it and they get big audiences? Like, could you get someone on one of those platforms talking about, hey, did you know there was a guy named Robert E. Howard who came up with this character? You know, maybe like a ghostly figure like Jeff Shanks could hop on one of these live streams or something. And I don't know.
In my copious free time, sure.
Those are quite popular from what I understand.
It's true.
Well,
understand.
is Howard's work available in some sort of audio form? Because Lovecraft is now, and
Yeah.
I think that does a lot for readers these days. Stick it in your car radio and listen to it.
That's a great point because I don't think I'm going to say this as an English teacher, but I don't think that many people are actually reading. A lot of people are listening to audiobooks,
Good.
podcasts, like you said, like Twitch streaming. That's where they do a lot of the streaming for games. People want to have that going, and if we can tap into that, that's what I say. Digitally, Howard, there's a lot of fertile ground that we could be, using.
Yeah,
And
there
if we
are
could get Howard
audiobooks of the.
Yeah, I see. Yeah,
Um,
there are audiobooks
mhm.
of some of the Del Rey editions. That's good.
Yep.
Well, thank you guys all very much. I think we've all very much enjoyed the panel. It's been a great discussion. I had fun moderating for you. Um, little claps. Little claps for me, and also from everybody down there. Um, I guess I can set you free. I will free you of your bonds, and pass it over to Ben for our first intermission. Let everybody go get some water and get ready for the next panel up right away. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.
Yep, great fun.
Thanks, everyone.